Arthur's mind kept drifting back to Sylvie. That night, when her form changed as she absorbed mana from Udo's horn, haunted him. Days passed, filled with meetings, training, and strategizing, but the image lingered. Sylvie, on the other hand, seemed unbothered. She had even asked for solitude to continue absorbing mana from the horn, leaving Arthur to rely on their bond to sense her calmness. The reality of the present hit like a brick when a voice boomed through the room, snapping Arthur back to the meeting he was supposed to be attending. Surrounded by lances, council members, and the ever-distracted Gideon, Arthur realized he'd been gripping a quill so hard it snapped in two. Smooth move, General. The topic of the train project was up for discussion. Gideon, enthusiastic as ever, began detailing their plans. His excitement wavered when questions about the train's vulnerability arose. Arthur stepped in, presenting a calculated solution: an underground railway. Practical, safe, and unfortunately, costly. The king's skepticism over the expense was countered by Arthur's well-crafted argument. This wasn't just a train. It was an opportunity to address poverty and the soaring costs of mana-beast transport while providing jobs. Then came the touchy subject of slave labor. King Glader saw it as a cost-effective option, but Arthur and Virion swiftly dismantled that notion. They emphasized skill development and long-term productivity over forced labor. Gideon chimed in, adding that motivated workers would accomplish far more than unwilling slaves. The result? A unanimous decision to move forward with the project, minus the slavery. As the meeting concluded, Arthur felt a mix of relief and anticipation. This train project was more than logistics. It was the dawn of an industrial revolution in this world. Even if the war with Alakria pushed these changes, Arthur couldn't deny the potential for progress. Later, walking alongside Virion through the dim corridors of the stronghold, Arthur found humor in the elf commander's self-proclaimed wisdom. Their banter was interrupted as they approached a heavily secured door, guarded by a sharp-eyed elf. The young sentinel, visibly skilled despite his modest appearance, greeted them with a hint of humor about the endless time underground. Arthur smirked, thinking that even amidst war and duty, some things, like dry wit, remained universal. Virion introduced the guard standing before the thick metal door with a smirk. Albold Chaffer, a proud member of a long-standing military family serving the Aeroliths, greeted them with a mixture of curiosity and sarcasm. When he mentioned rumors about Arthur potentially becoming the new heir to the Aerolith family, Arthur barely contained his irritation, shooting Virion a pointed look. Albold, ever the joker despite his prestigious lineage, took his duties seriously. Well, mostly. He acknowledged Arthur's reputation and, after some back-and-forth banter, unlocked the door, sending them off with a dramatic farewell, as if they were off on a grand adventure rather than stepping into the stifling dungeon. Inside, the air was thick with the stale scent of decay and dampness. The cells, though spacious and well-lit, still held an eerie presence. Arthur found himself staring at the cell he had once occupied, the memories lingering. Virion, sensing his unease, reminded him of the delicate political balance at play, letting the Gladers off the hook despite their involvement in the plot against him. Arthur knew it made sense, but it didn't make swallowing the truth any easier. After some conversation about the elusive Asura Lord Aldir, they arrived at a particular cell that had been transformed into a more comfortable living space. Inside, Micah, the dwarven lance, was lounging with a book, looking as relaxed as a prisoner could be. Their conversation was light-hearted, but Arthur couldn't ignore the weight of the situation. Micah was here not because of guilt, but because of the mess Ulfred and Rodius had left behind. After assuring her that things were progressing and cracking a joke about her prison setup being leagues better than Rodius, Arthur bid farewell and moved deeper into the dungeon. The lower levels were a different beast entirely. The stench hit like a physical blow, a mix of chemicals, blood, and something far worse. Holding back the urge to gag, Arthur followed Virion to the cells housing the most dangerous captives. They were greeted by Gentry, a hunched old man with a hooked nose and a penchant for unsettling grins, and his burly, blood-splattered assistant. Their first stop was Rodius. The former trusted ally of Elijah was now reduced to a shadow of his former self. Bloodied, battered, and mentally shattered, Rodius sat motionless, his eyes vacant. Arthur took no pleasure in seeing him like this, but the necessity of his suffering wasn't lost on him. Gentry explained with twisted pride how his sound-based magic had reduced Radius to this state, though the traitor's mind remained stubbornly resistant. The final stop was the retainer, Uto. Locked in a coffin-like vault inscribed with intricate runes, the Vritra still had an air of defiance despite his restraints. As the vault door creaked open, his eyes met Arthur's with a knowing glint, and a wicked grin spread across his face. "Hello, pup," he sneered. Arthur's stomach twisted. This was going to be anything but easy. Uto's sinister voice echoed through the chamber, sending an involuntary shiver down Arthur's spine. Despite the fact that he was securely restrained inside an anti-magic vault, a gnawing sense of unease remained. To everyone else in the room, Arthur was the hero who had bested Uto. The reality? Both he and Sylvie had barely managed to put a dent in him. "You look a little uncomfortable, Uto," Arthur quipped, masking his own apprehension behind a smug grin. The retainer's smirk vanished, replaced by a deep snarl. "What did you do with my horns, lesser pup?" Arthur casually pulled out the black horn from his dimension ring and began tossing it into the air nonchalantly. "Oh, you mean this? Insolent little—" "Stop." Arthur cut him off with a raised hand. "I'm not here to trade insults. I've got better things to do." Udo's gray complexion darkened, his wild eyes filled with hatred. "I swear to Vritra, if I get out, you'll wish you died that day." Arthur shook his head slowly. "I'm sure there's something you want more than revenge. You're dying to know how you lost to me, aren't you? That mystery must be eating you alive." The retainer's face twisted with rage as he strained against his restraints. "Close it," Arthur ordered, locking eyes with Uto until the thick, rune-inscribed door shut with a final thud. "What was that?" one of the commanders started to ask, but Arthur silenced him with a finger to his lips. Once they reached the entrance of the dungeon level, he spoke softly. "Leave him be for now." Gentry, the ever-curious interrogator, furrowed his brows. "We've been torturing him physically and mentally, but I've never seen him this riled up." "Hallucinations and physical pain won't break that arrogant sadomasochist," Arthur replied. Virion tilted his head. "Sado what?" "Never mind." Arthur waved it off with a faint smile. "Just don't open his vault." "With all due respect, General," Gentry protested, "it's best to strike while his mental defenses are weak. What if he figures out how you beat him?" "He won't," Arthur assured, "and that's what's going to drive him insane. Let him stew until I'm ready." Virion shot him a wary glance. "I don't like that look. What are you planning?" Arthur's eyes gleamed. "I'll be the one to interrogate him when the time comes." "Are you ready?" Emily's voice came from behind a sea of blinking panels. She looked like she was piloting an aircraft from Arthur's previous life. "Almost," he replied, strapping in the last of the bands around his arms. Wincing as one bit in too tightly, he muttered under his breath. "We'll be doing a 3-on-1 scenario today, so stay focused, General Arthur," Alanis reminded him. Arthur stretched, loosening his limbs. "Got it. What's my restriction?" "Water and its deviant form, of course," Alanis confirmed after a brief scan. Arthur walked to the other side of the training room, facing Camus, Hester, and Kathleen. His encounter with Uto earlier weighed on his mind. He wasn't the one who had defeated Uto. Sylvie had. And that truth gnawed at him. The signal was given, and Arthur exploded into motion, a blur closing in on Hester with a sharpened wind blade encasing his hand. The fire mage's eyes widened but reacted swiftly, grabbing his arm and reinforcing herself with mana. Arthur allowed her to hold him, only to grip her arm in return and yank her forward. With a quick pivot, he flipped her to the ground. As he prepared to land another blow, a blast of water drenched him. Before he could react, the water froze solid, locking him in place. With a burst of fire, he thawed himself free, but Hester had already retreated. Ignoring her for the moment, Arthur turned to Kathleen. He trapped her legs with earth magic, watching as she coated herself in ice, clearly a lesson from Varay. He kept reinforcing the earthen shackles, layer upon layer, restricting her movements. As she struggled to free herself, Arthur prepared his next strike. A gauntlet of crackling lightning formed around his fist, and he raised it with a twinge of guilt. Kathleen's determined gaze met his, fearless. Just before the blow connected, a gust of wind sent Arthur tumbling back. "Erupt!" Camus shouted, unleashing a cyclone. Walls of wind surrounded Arthur, trapping him in a vortex of low pressure. His breath quickened as the roar of the wind drowned everything else. His fight wasn't over yet. The swirling walls of the tornado closed in, threatening to hurl Arthur wherever they pleased. Gritting his teeth, he muttered under his breath, "Annoying." His lungs burned, and the dwindling oxygen made his mind hazy, but there was no way he was backing down. The smart move would have been to burrow underground, escape the relentless storm. But no, Udo's smug grin flashed in his mind, that taunting look as if saying, "Run or hide, that's all you can do." And that thought alone fueled a rage deep within. To hell with strategy. If this couldn't be faced head-on, what hope was there against the scythes? Planting his feet firmly to the ground with earth magic, Arthur fought back with an opposing wind current. He could feel the strain in his muscles, tears welling up from the pressure. He was getting somewhere, until a dull, unforgiving pain slammed into his back, forcing him forward. With his feet stuck to the ground, he awkwardly bowed, pushing off with his hands to stay upright. His eyes darted to the culprit, a massive chunk of ice. And it wasn't alone. Dozens more circled him like vultures, each easily twice the size of his head. Kathleen had really outdone herself. Some of the ice boulders were blunt instruments of pain, while others sliced through his clothes, leaving behind stinging wounds. Still, Arthur pressed on, stubborn to a fault, determined to overpower the spell. The tornado pounded his body, each impact turning him into a battered punching bag. His head spun, his limbs felt numb, and exhaustion clawed at him like an insatiable beast. But the thought of defeating Udo, even in this imagined battle, kept him standing. Then came the fire. The ice boulders vanished, and in their place, flames danced within the twister, creating a blazing cyclone. Arthur's vision spotted, his mind spinning, and soon enough, darkness claimed him. When his eyes blinked open, he found himself staring up at Kathleen's face, the ceiling of the training room looming behind her. A cool sensation rested on his forehead, a damp, ice-cold handkerchief. "Your body's still hot. Keep it on," Kathleen said, her voice laced with a hint of concern. Arthur groaned. "Thanks, and sorry about earlier." She shook her head. "We were training, although the elders might not see it that way." Q Boone's booming voice. "Damn straight we don't." His bearded face popped into view. "You fought like a kid throwing a tantrum. There were at least 12 ways to get out of that situation without brute forcing it." Arthur clenched his jaw. "Yeah, I know, but I wanted to see if I could overpower it. If I can't even do that, how am I supposed to defeat the retainers and scythes?" Boone was ready to retort, but Camus beat him to it. "You're feeling the pressure, aren't you?" Silence. Admitting it meant acknowledging weakness, something Arthur struggled with. He wasn't just some young prodigy. He carried the wisdom of a past life as a king, and yet, even with that advantage, he felt inadequate. Camus sighed. "A war isn't fought alone. You might hold the title of a lance, but you're not carrying the whole continent on your back." From across the room, Hester's voice cut through. "You're not that important, you know." Arthur chuckled, despite himself. Kathleen pressed her cool fingers against his forehead again. "Trust in your soldiers. Just like the people rely on the lances, you need to rely on others." Arthur sighed, pressing the cold cloth against his eyes. For a moment, he just lay there, absorbing their words. Then, with a laugh, he shot up. "Feels like therapy." Surrounding him were Kathleen, the elders, and Emily and Alanis, who watched with quiet concern. Arthur smiled. "Thanks, everyone, for helping me train and for keeping me in check." Hester nodded approvingly. "I think we can skip today's debrief. I'm sure you know what you did wrong." Bund smirked. "Get some rest. Tomorrow I'm going all out." Emily chimed in. "I'll have the lifeline artifact ready by morning, even if I have to pull an all-nighter." Arthur waved them off and made his way home, lost in thought. He barely noticed when he reached his doorstep, exhaustion weighing him down. Too tired to wash up, he collapsed onto his bed. "Everything okay, Sylv?" He reached out mentally. No response, but he could sense her calm presence. That was enough. Staring at the ceiling, Arthur stretched out his hand. This body, this life, after nearly 20 years as Arthur, it still felt small compared to his past self, Gray. Memories of the Paragon duels, those high-stakes battles between king duelists, flooded his mind. Compared to those fights, this war seemed even heavier. Letting out a deep sigh, Arthur whispered to himself, This war isn't fought alone, Arthur. Arthur woke up, feeling the familiar shape of Udo's horn in his hand. After checking in on his mana core and body, he realized how close he was to reaching the white core stage. It was a big milestone, and he was glad he hadn't used Virion's artifact prematurely. After ensuring Sylvie was okay through their mental bond, Arthur got out of bed and started his day with some stretches. He practiced a series of fluid martial arts movements he had learned from Cordry, making full use of his body's capabilities while synchronizing his mana flow to enhance each strike. In the midst of his morning routine, Boo, his sister's large bond animal, poked his head into Arthur's room, interrupting him right as a powerful palm strike was unleashed. The air shockwave made Boo's skin flap comically, and Arthur couldn't help but laugh. His sister Ellie joined in the fun, curious about the commotion. She squeezed into the room, and Arthur decided to amuse her further by conjuring a gust of wind that made Boo's face ripple dramatically, which had them both cracking up. Their laughter carried them all the way to the training room, where Emily was already setting up. She looked exhausted from working on data for Arthur's final training session. The training began with everyone geared up and ready. Kathleen, Camuth, Hester, and Bund surrounded Arthur, knowing well his capabilities. They took their positions seriously, aware that any lapse in concentration could lead to defeat. The session escalated with a friendly wager about who would pay for a feast Virion had planned. The stakes were high, especially when Alanis revealed the feast's extravagant cost. This only added an extra layer of competitiveness to the match. Arthur's training paid off as he navigated through a series of spells and maneuvers from his opponents. He combined his knowledge of earth and wind to move swiftly across the battlefield, cleverly manipulating his environment to gain the upper hand. Kathleen was the first major threat with her high mana levels. Arthur cleverly used a dust cloud for cover and managed to get close enough to disrupt her spellcasting. He even used her own ice magic against her, thawing the frost that formed on his hand with a quick spell. As the battle continued, Arthur faced a coordinated assault from Hester's lightning and Bund's earth magic. He used his ingenuity, creating a water barrier from the steam his fire magic produced when meeting Kathleen's ice. The barrier protected him from a barrage of lightning, and he redirected the electrically charged water at Bund, effectively taking him out of the fight. The battle ended with everyone acknowledging Arthur's strategic prowess, and despite the high cost of the feast looming over them, it was clear that the training session had been about more than just the stakes. It was a testament to Arthur's growth and his readiness for the challenges ahead. With only Hester and Camus remaining and Arthur at full command of his elements, it wasn't long before he outmaneuvered them both. 20 minutes later, a visibly exhausted Arthur flopped back onto the ground, his chest heaving. I win, he panted, satisfaction mingling with fatigue. Camus, propping himself against a wall, managed to catch his breath before nodding. Congratulations, but there are more pressing matters. Indeed, Hester agreed, wiping sweat from her brow with a handkerchief. Who's going to pay for the exorbitant cost of the feast? Wasn't it decided that the losers were going to pay? Bund interjected, seeming a bit confused by the question. Arthur sat up, sharing the same thought. The agreement was clear in his mind.